Good evening, and thank you for allowing me to come into your living rooms.
Alfred Hitchcock became one of Hollywood's most successful directors through the 1940s. Hitchcock followed his Oscar-winning big break into Hollywood, Rebecca, in 1940, with a string of successes, including Suspicion, Saboteur, Shadow of a Doubt, Spellbound, and Notorious. But towards the end of the 40s and into the 50s, Hitch began experimenting, making bolder, riskier choices both technically and thematically. In 1948, Hitchcock made one of his most subversive films to date, Rope, his first film in colour, an adaptation of a stage play set entirely in a New York apartment and seemingly shot in a single take. A story of two men murdering their former classmate, hiding the body in a chest, and inviting the victim's family and friends to unknowingly dine around the corpse.
Brandon, we've got to hide it.
Why?
Why?
Yes, why? It's only a piece of rope, Philip, an ordinary household article. Why hide it?
A few years later, Hitchcock returned to this claustrophobic setting of a New York apartment block with one of his most successful films. Rear Window was about a man witnessing a murder in his next-door neighbour's apartment and remains to this day one of the most beloved movies ever made.
Precinct 6, Sergeant Allgood.
Hello. Look, a man is assaulting a woman at 125 West 9th Street, second floor, at the rear. No, make it fast.
Both Rope and Rear Window solidified Hitchcock's reputation as not only the master of suspense, but also the man who established the home as one of the most dangerous and potentially terrifying locations.
What are you going to do? I don't want to, but I'm going to look inside that chest.
Are you crazy?
I hope so. With all my heart, I hope I'm crazy.
Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of home invasion, and we discuss two terrifying Hitchcock classics, Rear Window and Rope. Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike Munzer, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre, one subgenre at a time. We are currently in the middle of our 9th series exploring the evolution of home invasion, and this is part 6. In this week's episode, as that intro suggested, it's a Hitchcock double bill. We're going to be talking about two apartment-based movies that he made, Rope from 1948 and Rear Window from 1954. What an incredible double bill. If you guys haven't seen these films, please check them out before you listen to our discussion. So later on in this episode, I will be joined by filmmaker and friend of the pod, Jen Handorf, to discuss both these films in depth. But first of all, a very special little interview for you with one of my personal heroes. If you grew up around the same time as me as a cinephile in the UK, you're bound to have been a fan of Mark Cousins, because as well as being a great filmmaker and storyteller from as early as the late 80s, Mark Cousins went on to present some really beloved film programs on the television, such as Moviedrome in the late 90s and early 2000s, where he introduced me to so many films I had never seen before and fell completely in love with. Mark Cousins went on to make some amazing stuff like The Story of Film and Odyssey, which is a 930-minute series that explored the history of cinema from the birth of the medium all the way up to the sort of 2000s. And of course, The Story of Film and Odyssey was a huge inspiration for this very podcast. Since then, he's also made a bunch of really interesting films about filmmakers, like The Eyes of Orson Welles, and his latest movie, My Name is Alfred Hitchcock, which takes a look in depth at the career and the life of Alfred Hitchcock, but with a unique spin because it's actually narrated by Alfred Hitchcock from beyond the grave. The film is going to be released later on this year in the UK. It's absolutely brilliant, but I sat down to chat to Mark about his relationship with Alfred Hitchcock and what it was like diving into the mind of Hitch in order to make this very special film. So here is my interview with documentarian and filmmaker Mark Cousins. I am delighted to be joined by the brilliant Mark Cousins. Hello, Mark.
Hello, Mike.
Thank you so much for being here. First of all, Mark, I'm a huge fan of all your work. I've kind of devoured most of your films, particularly your sort of documentary films on filmmakers. And I loved your most recent, My Name is Alfred Hitchcock. Tell us a little bit about where this idea of focusing on Hitchcock came from for your next project.
You know, like all of us, we all have our Hitchcock, don't we? You know, you love Hitchcock. Everybody listening will have their own personal Hitchcock story, you know, and I have mine, you know, and he was the kind of entry drug for me to cinema, the fear cinema, horror cinema in general, you know, so of course, I love him, but, you know, I'm always reluctant to do something that's been talked about a lot, and Hitchcock has been talked about a lot, as you know, but my producer messaged me and said, it's exactly 100 years since the first Hitchcock films. Could you do something? And then I thought, yeah, I could do something. I could try and do something new, a new way of looking at Hitchcock, which is very difficult, as you know, and because he's been spoken about every which way, but I thought I could have a new angle.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about that new angle. How did you approach Alfred Hitchcock for your film?
Well, in my movies, I'm often very interested in who's talking and, you know, who's telling the story. So a while ago, I made a film about Orson Welles, and I thought instead of doing the standard, you know, objective male voice telling the story of Orson Welles, maybe I should talk directly to Orson Welles. So that sort of seemed to work. So with this Hitchcock film, I thought, why don't I go even further? And why don't I not just talk to Hitchcock? Why don't I become him in some way? So why don't I write a 2-hour film which is narrated by Hitchcock himself? And of course, that's a bit scary. And I was influenced by, you know, the monologues by different people. So I thought, why don't I imagine how Hitchcock would describe his own films?
I love that. And of course, you've got Alistair McGowan, right? The great impressionist and actor doing a perfect Alfred Hitchcock in your film, right? How did you cast him? Was he somebody who you had in mind from the start?
Well, I mean, it's incredible, you know. So it's if you're going to do a 2-hour film with the voice of Hitchcock, you need somebody really great to do it, you know. And I'm lucky enough to know Simon Callow, the great actor. And I messaged him and I said, look, I need somebody to do the voice of Hitchcock. Who would it be? Who could it be? And Simon said the best person in the business, the best ear in the business is Alistair McGowan. So we asked his agent, and we didn't hear, and I thought I had a plan B and a plan C, and as you know, other people have played Hitchcock before. And then I got a voice message on my phone, and it was Hitchcock. It was Alistair McGowan, and and he's a proper. I mean, to see people who are brilliant at what they do is so moving, and it was really moving to work with this guy who could do Hitchcock effortlessly.
That's amazing, because Alfred Hitchcock's voice is so recognizable. You know, he was one of the first and still remains one of the few directors who he himself, the man, was just as much the star of his work, really, yes. Wasn't he?
I think he was his own logo, wasn't he? He was his own brand. He was his own. He marketed himself really well, so he impacted the public's consciousness very directly, not only through his films but his TV shows, etc. But because he was a popular entertainer, you know, he understood that his job was to get into our imaginations, into our fears, into our desires, and all that sort of stuff, you know. So of course he made great art, but it was extremely popular entertainment art as well, and that combination, you know, is the sort of classic Hollywood masala, you could say, you know. And so I think for loads of us, you know, before I became interested in the art of cinema, I just thought, wow, there are these films by this guy, you know. But I think for a lot of people listening to this, like Hitchcock might be, maybe David Fincher as well, but there are certain filmmakers who introduce you to the idea that cinema is an art.
Yeah. And, there are more difficult, more troubling elements of Hitchcock as a man. And you mentioned, having to get inside Hitchcock's head for this movie. How was that, getting in Hitchcock's head?
Well, I wonder what you mean by troubling. I mean, there are lots of rumours about Hitchcock, and from the right-wing press, when Hitchcock died, the newspapers like the Daily Mail in the UK had all these rumours that he was, like he was, that he damaged the lives of lots of people, the dark side of the genius. I'm a passionate feminist, so of course I looked into anything related to the allegations around any kind of the way that he hurt women. But, we need to be evidence-based about this. And I knew, I knew Janet Leigh well, and I sat and watched the shower scene in Psycho with her, and so I knew quite a few of the way. I knew Teresa Wright, who was in one of his earlier films, so I knew sort of some of the Hitchcock women. And it's important not to believe, the kind of right-wing rumors about Hitchcock. Yes, he behaved really badly with Tippi Hedren, absolutely. He did, and she writes about that in her book. And she describes in detail what happened, but there's no evidence beyond that. The right-wing press, the tabloid press, really, really tried to find other women who would make accusations against Hitchcock, and they found none. Janet Leigh loved him. Ingrid Bergman loved him, going way back all to the 1940s. A lot of the women that he collaborated with loved him. So we need to be evidence-based about this stuff, and also not perpetuate the rumors if they're not true.
So tell me about how you prepped for this film. Obviously, Hitchcock has got such a vast filmography. Did you revisit every single movie for this? How was the prep?
Yeah, my prep was quite simple. I watched all the films in order.
Amazing.
And it was during lockdown, and we were all looking for something to do. And I thought, why don't I start at the beginning and watch everything? And I thought, like I'm sure you think, Mike, that I'd seen everything, but I hadn't seen everything. I hadn't seen the silent film The Farmer's Wife. I hadn't seen a bunch of stuff, I don't think even I'd seen The Ring, and there's always more to learn, and it was great. As soon as I started watching, my mind began to whir, and I thought, okay, I can see a film in this, and it's about the tenderness of Hitchcock. It's there are other themes. I tried to avoid some of the obvious themes like suspense and it's saying, but there are many other themes in Hitchcock which I felt were slightly less dealt with, and I thought I could deal with them in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, one of the things I love about your work is, you do deal with the lesser known films and filmmakers. One of the things I loved about The Story of Film and Odyssey is that you don't show us the big players necessarily. You show us the lesser known international filmmakers throughout history. And it's the same in this movie. You spend a lot of time on those early or lesser known Hitchcock films. Was that something that you went into sort of deliberately and, not using the big hitters as much?
Yeah, I think so. I literally watched and I thought, what is great? And when you look at the films again, some of them are better than you think. Like, I think Rope is amazing, really.
Oh.
It's so serious, and Wrong Man is so good. And so, some things go slightly up when you rewatch them. And the Hitchcock films, of course, Vertigo is still great, Bird's still great. But I think Saboteur for me is just such a masterpiece. It's that one with, Robert Cummins. It's a slightly less well-known Hitchcock picture, but I think it's the first real American picture he made. It was lovely to have an opportunity just to look back at this massive career that we all think we know, and with a bit of humbleness, because I realized I didn't know the career as well as I thought.
One of the things that's great about your film is that you bring Hitchcock to life in the present day in a way, right? And he talks about film as if he's alive now. And, It got me thinking, how do you think Hitchcock would find, cinema today? He was always trying new things, right? Through whether it was 3D or the single take or whatever. Do you think, he'd have embraced kind of filmmaking today, whether it's, streaming or digital or VR or whatever it might be?
I think totally. I think that Alfred Hitchcock, because he was an innovator, he always wanted to jump ahead. Like, it was a classic example of jumping ahead of the moment, and then everybody after Psycho felt that they needed to catch up in some way, So even a film like Dial M for Murder, which is thought of as a sort of slightly theatrical thing, it's daring. So Hitchcock definitely, if he was alive now, he would have embraced certainly the miniaturization of the film process, the fact that you can shoot on tiny cameras and things. I think, you can see even back then from the 60s onwards, his innovations, how he tried to surf the wave of technology. And I think he will continue to do so.
One of the areas that we're focusing on specifically in this season of the podcast is horror within the home and the domestic space. So we're looking specifically at Hitchcock films that deal with that. These movies like Rear Window and Rope and Dial M for Murder, as you've already mentioned, that take place entirely within a domestic space, right? Your film deals with areas like this too. You talk about height and space and escape and that kind of thing. What was it specifically about Hitchcock as a filmmaker, do you think, that made him so successful in, I don't know, kind of playing with and establishing the kind of the geography of the domestic space in his films?
I think that's a fascinating question. You think of a parallel filmmaker like Billy Wilder, for example. Billy Wilder was not interested in family at all. There are almost no families in Billy Wilder pictures. If you think of the famous ones like The Apartment or Something Like It Hot, there are no families. But Hitchcock was really interested in families and the sort of kind of sweaty, the where you feel too close to other people, like a kind of the claustrophobia of the home. I think, and the home and other kind of space, confined spaces, So I think he was very good at that, and even the remake of The Man Who Knew Too Much, when they're sitting on the bus, and so he was very interested. He was a family man himself, of course. He came from a very kind of family world, and he was interested in the anxiety of what a family is and what a home is and what a domestic space is. And so definitely you see that, not through his whole career, because of course, as you know, he was very interested in the travelogue and, let's go on a holiday somewhere. But definitely you're right to that idea of the kind of confined space, which, as you say, is central to horror. Confinement, I think, is central to horror.
Yeah, and that interesting idea, the sorts of things that you point out in your film that I hadn't noticed initially is, that he will choose to go up high, looking down, and he chooses interesting ways, I suppose, to kind of show us the space and these people's position within the space as well,
Often he goes high, often, what he's sort of trying to do in those films, whether it's Vertigo where he goes high or whether it's Notorious, or there are lots of examples, he's often trying to shock you and to see the confinement of a space, So suddenly when you go cut to a really high shot, you think, wow, look, they're all in this kind of fish tank, they're all in this kind of rock pool and they're all swimming in it, and a lot of his characters are swimming in a confined space, And he talked about ours, he talked about that in musical terms. He said when he went high, it was like a high note on a violin. And so that was very interesting. But definitely the question of the kind of fear of confinement. And many of us, lots of people listening to this will have been brought up in environments where they felt confined. I certainly felt that, and so there's kind of social and political dimension to it as well. What if you're constrained? What if your home life actually feels scary in some way? So Hitchcock really got that.
Yeah, it's interesting that you should say that actually as well, because, we are also going to look at the way in which the home for so many people over the last few years, right, since lockdown, since the pandemic, the home did change from a safe haven to a kind of prison, I suppose. And it's going to be interesting to see how filmmakers react to that. Yeah,
there's certain filmmakers like in Japan, Yasujiro Ozu, one of the greatest filmmakers, home for him was definitely a kind of safe place, a kind of as I said, like I said, rock pool, but actually maybe a harbor, a shelter from the storm. But for Hitchcock, the home was the storm. It was a place of turmoil. And so that's very valuable, because that's actually true for a lot of human beings, and Hitchcock got that, I think.
And a place of secrets too, I guess, of course, famously. One of the lines I loved in your film was, you say, he says, I enter my film as if it's a house to explore. What do you mean by that specifically? Is it that kind of that voyeurism, that curiosity, or is there sort of more to it than that?
Yeah, you remember that moment in the film, because quite often I use several examples where somebody walks into a house and then sort of slams the door behind them, a kind of labyrinth, if let's say that, a home is good and bad, it is a shelter from the storm, but it's also a place where people are hurt and terrorized, and Hitchcock understood the complexity of that, so when you go into these private spaces, these homes, these suburban houses, they can become labyrinths of fear. and so the ambiguity of that, I think Hitchcock definitely got.
Just out of interest, you don't concentrate purely on the kind of the horror stuff or the thriller stuff in Hitchcock's career, but I'd love to just ask you, Mark, personally, like, are you generally a kind of big horror cinema fan, and do you have any particular favourites in terms of filmmakers or areas of horror?
Yes, I am. I love horror. And my first, I was brought up in Belfast in the 70s, where we had the video libraries, and because it was, there were no police in those days then, like everything was available and bootlegged, and so the video nasties, all that sort of stuff of the 80s when I was growing up were all crucial to me, so I think it is very important. And then horror for me is still the most important genre, I think, and because it's got a more direct access to your nervous system than any other genre, and I've told this story before, but I remember particularly sitting, I was brought up very religious, and I remember sitting in my aunt's house, and we got a bootleg copy of The Exorcist, and I was far too young, and I was like many people, you see these films far too young, but I remember because of the Catholic upbringing, she blessed the video player with holy water, and The Exorcist was such a dangerous film that we needed to put holy water on the video player where we watched it, and how fantastic is that? What a way of telling a young person that this art form is dangerous, which of course it is.
So what's next for you, Mark? You're a very busy, prolific man. What other projects have you got coming up next?
I've got 3 edit suites going at the moment, and I go off to and I've made a film about fascism and Mussolini, which is coming out soon, and then Hitchcock films coming out soon, and then I've got other things. I'm just hungry to make stuff. I'm kind of an addict for making cinema. So lots more coming.
I love that. Well, tell people where they can find the Hitchcock film. Do we know yet when it's getting a release and where people are going to be able to see it?
Hitchcock film in the UK will come out in the autumn. I don't know exactly what cinemas, but it'll be in a bunch of cinemas. We've just done the poster, we've just done the trailer, so it's coming out in the autumn. And I'm going to San Francisco in 2 days' time, where it's showing there. So it's already showing in lots of other countries, but it's coming out in the UK in the autumn.
Amazing. And final question for you then, Mark. What is your favourite Hitchcock film? And has that favourite changed during the process of making this, or has your favourite always been the same?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I love the kind of, I love all the Freudian stuff, like Vertigo and Rear Window, and like lots of people listening, but I think now for me, Saboteur and Rope are the one really jump out at me now. Saboteur because of its politics. People think that Hitchcock was a conservative, but Saboteur is a kind of, quite a radical film, and Rope is so daring. So they're the two that are forefront in my mind at the moment.
I love Rope so much, and I think revisiting it, I was just reminded of how that film is kind of often spoken about as just being a technical exercise, right? The single take thing. But actually, there's so much going on in that film. There is so much subversive, dark stuff. I absolutely love Rope. It's one of my favorites too.
And beyond Rope, what would your other favorites be?
Oh man, it's so hard, isn't it? I mean, I think it's the big ones, it's the obvious ones for me, in that it's Psycho, of course. It's probably the movie I've watched more than any other of his. But I also think Rear Window, it feels like such an obvious thing to say, but it is so perfect. But actually, rewatching Rebecca for the podcast, I actually think Rebecca is stunning, and even though it doesn't necessarily feel like a quintessential Hitchcock, it is brimming with interesting stuff.
I think that's really interesting, that because, there's a femininity about Hitchcock as well, which isn't often talked about. And Rebecca's a very female film in some way. It's the first film that he made, as you know, when he went to America. And I think that I love that picture. So it's really good to emphasize that one as well.
Amazing. Well, Mark Cousins, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Mike. What a pleasure talking to you.
One more time, a huge thank you to the brilliant Mark Cousins. That is another real bucket list moment there, getting to have Mark on the podcast. So a huge thank you again for Mark and his time. So let's get into some Hitchcock films. Joining me to discuss all things Rope and Rear Window, a longtime friend of this pod. She is a filmmaker. She's a film producer. She's produced such horror classics as The Borderlands, one of my favourite found footage movies, which is celebrating its 10-year anniversary this year. She was last here on the podcast in our vampire series discussing Near Dark with me, and she's back. Hello, Jen Handorf.
Hello, Mike. How are you doing?
I am really good. Come on in, make yourself comfortable, take a seat. How are you doing?
I'm good. I am operating on, every brain cell is being used for something, and that is not efficient, but it's fun, so I'm working on it.
Yeah, well, just before we started recording, you were telling me about the multitude of things you've been working on. Are you allowed to talk about any of them on the record yet, or not?
I am, actually. I'm allowed to talk about a lot of it, which is great. So I just finished producing a film for Ty Shawnee, who is a fantastic artist and won the Turner Prize in 2019 and just has the most spectacular vision, and I love her and I can't wait to see what she does with it. I think it's beautiful and it was a great experience. I'm directing a piece next week, which is a really amazing awareness campaign to help stop image abuse, which is a really important issue amongst teenagers. It's the idea of sharing images without consent. And it's a real problem. So I'm excited to be lending my voice to that and Dan's effects. It's still horror.
Of course.
It is a horrible thing.
Of course.
There's some other bits that are sort of a bit early. We're working on some fantastic screenings for The Borderlands for our 10-year anniversary, so that's exciting.
Yes.
And then there's some things in the VR AR world that are exciting but a bit nascent. So I need to stay. I need to resist my urge to absolutely blurt out everything I'm excited about. But instead, I'm going to do that thing where it's like, oh, I really shouldn't say.
Yeah.
I really shouldn't say.
I mean, that's good. That's all part of it, right? It's all part of it. I love it. So we are talking about home invasion. Well, we're not necessarily talking about home invasion in the strictest sense with these two films, but generally speaking, this series, I'm talking about kind of domestic set horror movies and home invasion horror movies. What are your thoughts on kind of traditional home invasion movies, Jen?
It does definitely freak me out. Are you doing People Under the Stairs out of curiosity?
Yes, I am.
Who's doing
so
that
excited.
one? Who's talking about that with you?
Who is that? It's Michael Blythe from the BFI.
That's gonna be wicked. That'll be very cool.
Really excited.
I'm sure I've said this before, but I'm one of these people who gets night terrors. So the idea of waking up and seeing what you're absolutely 100% positive is a terrifying person, but is actually just a pile of clothes. And sort of that whole thing. And then equally, you know what? My favorite image is I think it's in The Conjuring when the big guy is over the bassinet in the very opening.
Oh my God.
You know the one I mean?
Yes, I know the one. That's Insidious.
Insidious, yeah. I mean, you'll forgive me for swapping them in my brain, but yeah.
I know. Imagine getting those two confused.
Imagine mixing that up. But that image, I feel like, is night terrors, home invasions, sort of real. And
completely agree.
So I love it. After is is it Wait Until Dark with Audrey Hepburn is another fantastic one that like
incredible,
really, really struck me. For those who don't know, Audrey Hepburn is a blind woman who is living in her apartment and has accidentally gotten a hold of a piece of MacGuffin that some bad men want to take from her, and so it's about them getting into her home and using her blindness against her.
With one of the all-time great jump scares in that movie as well. Absolutely incredible.
The whole thing is just beautiful. Like, before I knew what a jump scare was, even I think it was on Turner Classic Movies or something. But which is a nice seg into Hitchcock, because these are, you know, films that are ostensibly G-rated, but are absolutely nerve-crunching.
Yeah, completely agree. We've talked about a couple of Hitchcock films already this series. We talked about Rebecca as this kind of almost kind of gothic ghost story in this house of Mandalay, and then also Dial M for Murder, much more kind of classic, there's an intruder in the house kind of story. Hitchcock seems to have this kind of obsession with kind of looking in on people's homes, right, and people's private lives. It feels like Hitchcock is really good at when it comes to these kind of domestic set thrillers or horrors, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think you know, he is very much about the observation of the camera, and people, smarter people than I, Laura Mulvey and all that lot, have a lot to say about this, and Hitchcock and the male gaze and objectification and you know, camera as viewer and all these kinds of things. And I think that's because that's what fascinated him. I think he enjoyed using a camera as a tool to view the world, and he enjoyed exploring all of that and what it meant, because we think about things that are archetypal Hitchcock, and his narratives are never really complicated, and in fact being simplistic is one of the, you know, stylistic things people say about his narratives, but the way he depicts them is always novel. You get films like Lifeboat, you get films like Rope, so Lifeboat experimenting with single locations, Rope, single locations, long takes, filming on that color ROM in the background that's constantly changing, filming it in real time, but it was based on a play. Then you get with Rear Window, he's again experimenting with this incredibly elaborate set, and his lead character is a documentary photographer, like a war photographer capturing real life, has this incredibly long lens that ultimately allows him to see. I mean, Hitchcock, you know, we talk about the counter zoom, which is a classic Hitchcock look. We talk about the POV. We talk about, there's loads of stylistic shots and structures and techniques that Hitchcock is known for, and we love them. We absolutely eat them up.
Yeah, his films are, and I think what I love, because you're right, I mean, he must be the most written about, you know, directed by academics in the history of cinema, right? But what I love, and that anyone who studied film has to watch Hitchcock and study Hitchcock, but what I love is that his films are so interesting to discuss and analyze and pick apart, but also so entertaining, surface level, just really fun as well. Like, there's something about them that never feels like homework to me. Like, I am always happy to sit down and rewatch Rope or Rear Window or Vertigo. You know, they're just like fun films, you know.
100%. And I really think that's because the stories are simple, so they really work. He doesn't go off-piste with his stories. He keeps them in that. And again, a lot of them are adaptations. So he takes them from stories that he knows will work, that are structurally sound. And then he puts his, you know, he gets his writers in who he worked with the same people all the time, and they put their spin on it. Incredible writers who would go on to do other incredible things. And also, I think for viewers, we get all of these little dopamine kicks of novelty, because he is experimenting. Every time he does a film, he's trying something out.
Yeah.
And I think that's awesome. And I'm sad that the fact that algorithms pick what's financeable now mean we don't have that same kind of experimentation in large scale film, because I think it's really beautiful and important. But, you know, we do still get films like, you know, black and white films like Belfast and that kind of thing. But it would be it would be amazing to see those kinds of visual risks taken on the regular.
It's true. I love that he, particularly in this phase of his career, he was doing stuff. He was trying stuff out. We'll talk about it, but obviously Rope, there's a lot of stuff he's experimenting with technically in Rope. Dial M for Murder, he tries 3D. Obviously Vertigo and all the insane kind of effects and visuals. Psycho, he kind of changes everything up narratively and like takes big risks there. Obviously you've got The Birds where he's, like hundreds of real birds and like absolutely amazing. And I love that his movies tend to, at this stage as well, he's either got these huge sprawling epics, these like North by Northwest, To Catch a Thief, like big Hollywood movies where he's like bouncing around to different locations or Mount Rushmore or whatever, or he's got these little thrillers all set in the confines of an apartment, right, as well. And he kind of excels at both at this stage of his career, which is amazing.
He understands cinematic language, and even more than that, he's inventing it in a way that we understand. And I think actually maybe that's the truth, that rather than him, and today as filmmakers we're asked to understand cinematic language, but he really was saying, this is how I'm going to give you this information. The contrazoom is how you're going to know that someone is having that queasy feeling in their stomach. That means they've had a realization. And then that is what that has meant in cinema forever, because that's how he used it.
Yes. And I love that he basically just loves to slightly torture his audience as well in a fun way, right? Like he's a trickster. He's a jokester. Like you feel like he's kind of deliberately kind of playing with us and toying with us as well, which I love,
Well, I think that brings us back to the ye old separating the art from the artist conversation as well, because I think Hitchcock liked to make people uncomfortable both in his audiences and in his immediate circle. And I think he studied it and he understood what makes people uncomfortable and how to draw that out of them. And he's very good at it. He's like the anti-Spielberg, It's sort of like if you want to feel like upset and nervous at the state of humanity, watch Hitchcock. If you want to feel uplifted and like everything's made of puppies, watch Spielberg.
Do you have a personal fave Hitchcock film?
Ooh, I do. Oh, I mean, I guess that's definitely a no, but like, because I love a lot of them. I just flipped through like 4 immediately in my head. I would say if I could only ever watch one Hitchcock again, it would probably be Rear Window, because I think
that's his perfect film, isn't it? Like it's perfect.
Well, and I don't think anybody can look out their window and see a building structure remotely like that and not think of it. It's definitely and you said it. I rarely do this, but I watched both of these films twice in preparation for this because they are so easy to watch.
Yeah.
And I felt like it warranted it. And there's little tricks and snippets. His worlds are so thoroughly designed, like kind of like Ridley Scott does now. But there's detail everywhere, so you can watch it multiple times and get more information from it. But all of the detail leads towards the conclusion. Perfectly put. Well, let's get into it. Let's begin by talking about Alfred Hitchcock's Rope from 1948.
You can't have fear, Neither of us can. That's the difference between us and the ordinary man, Philip. They talk about committing the perfect crime, but nobody does it. Nobody commits a murder just for the experiment of committing it. Nobody except us.
Brandon, how did you feel?
When?
During it?
I don't know, really. I don't remember feeling very much of anything. Till his body went limp. And I knew it was over.
And then?
Then I felt tremendously exhilarated. How did you feel?
Oh, Brandon, you don't think the party's a mistake, do you?
No, the party's the inspired finishing touch to our work. It's more, it's the signature of the artist. Not having it would be like
painting the picture and not hanging it.
Rope is probably a film you've heard your film friends talk about, but you've never seen. It's most famous for its long takes, and this is before like long take bros were a thing. So it's not just it's not just like, oh look, there's a meaningless 20-minute take that doesn't add anything to the film. the idea is that this is a really high stakes dinner party that's being revealed in real time. So the single takes are very unblinking and very in with Hitchcock's observations, and technically spectacular as well. But the reason it's the dinner party from hell is that there is one guest missing, because he happens to be dead in the bureau where they're all eating their dinner. So it's, it started as a play, as a lot of Hitchcock's works did. And I think that's one of the reasons it works as a single location piece, because it's meant to be viewed from one side. So you can move that camera pretty seamlessly in those steady, in what would probably a jib arm, I would guess, not a steady cam, but that you can move the camera from one side of the screen without the audience feeling like they need to get really close or in for close-ups or turn around and see the other side, because it was staged for that. It was made for that.
Exactly. Yeah, that kind of fourth wall that's missing right throughout.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And which, by the way, looking for where the seams in the walls are to know where they've moved the walls out of the way as the camera moves between rooms was my favorite pastime on my second watch.
Absolutely incredible, right? The fact that they had to take a door frame apart.
It was so well designed that you could see this seam, but you're like, that's great. I accept that. My belief is suspended temporarily.
So, I mean, this is a perfect example of what we were just talking about, right? Because yes, film nerds will all get like a nerd boner over the film, but
fully.
But even aside from all that stuff, what a fun film, right? As well, like, it's so funny, it's so dark and twisted. Actually, a really fucking dark story at the center of this like super fun bleak. Little film as well,
bleak.
Right?
And it's also, I think it's easy to forget how bleak it is, because the fun of it and the visual curiosity of it, the spectacle, the simplicity of the spectacle, do sort of overshadow everything else. And then you rewatch it and you're like, oh, they're fascists.
Yeah.
Oh, they're talking about the Ubermensch. That's my bad.
I know, right? It's like, holy shit. That's a lot of the stuff that slightly went over my head, I think, when I watched it as a student. I watched it, the first time I watched it was at university for film studies. And of course, it's all about the long takes and the technical kind of elements of this film that people focus on. But actually, some of the themes at the center of this, watching it now, I'm like, holy shit. This is quite ahead of its time and quite bold and daring in some of the stuff it's doing.
Well, absolutely. And speaking of over our heads, I'll tell you what went over my head loads until I read the notes and did my second watch of it this time, and still feel like has been diluted by time so incredibly, is the queer coding. I don't feel like
it's so good.
Where did the queer coding for this movie come from? And Grant, so this is one of the only ways I think it ages badly. Like, I think the camera work and that kind of stuff is timeless because people super copy it now, so we're really familiar with it. And even if it isn't as novel, it's brilliantly executed. But what was such a risque depiction of two men living together and going to someone's mother's, the context of that is completely lost on a modern audience. And, in the play, they were queer. It's written by a queer screenwriter. Both actors are queer. It is so queer. And that was totes lost on me. I did not see that subtext in the slightest. Although I do feel that it's sort of, if we're going to drill down into it, it's no pun intended, it's a little bit more like gay than strictly queer. Like, it's a very male.
It's super gay.
Yeah. Like, it's not like generalized queer experience now. It's a very like 1940s gay male experience that's being put to paper there. And, when it's there, it's very obvious. But because we have gotten so much more, thank the Lord, open as a society, it just seems like two dudes who are just mates, and then it turns out they super banging. They super banging each other.
It's amazing though, because I can't believe that he got away with it, because once you know it's there, it is so there. Like, even the stuff at the beginning when they've just killed the man is basically kind of post-coitus, right?
Exactly,
like
which on your second watch is very clearly an orgasm. Exactly.
They've had an orgasm. One of them is freaking out and it's like, don't open the blinds, don't turn the lights on yet. You know, let's just stay here for a second. And he's like, yeah, but we've got to check if there's any. And he's like, no, don't say it. Like, if you close your eyes and just listen to every line of dialogue that's said in that first 5 minutes, it just sounds like they've just been fucking on that dinner table,
100%. I feel like the play must have opened that way in a dark theater, and that's just brilliant. And it is like, and you know, maybe I'm naive. I'm just not having enough gay male sexual experiences, obviously, to have that in my brain. But yeah, and it's fantastic because it's, for someone who was such a bastard, Hitchcock didn't give a shit if somebody was gay. He didn't care if you were a commie. He didn't care if you were gay. He was mean and manipulative to everybody equally. So
yeah, no, totally. And he was very interested in putting that subtext in. Of course, like, this was during the time of the Hays Code. He had to be really careful with what he put on screen, but it's screaming at you through the subtext, this film, right? And Hitchcock really pushed that. And apparently, because like you said in the original play, it was overtly gay, and because it was a British play, it was British. The dialogue was British, and so the men called each other like dear and
Ducky,
darling, and apparently, like, I was watching a documentary on it. The screenwriter was going through the play script and kept like crossing out every reference where they called each other dear with biro, and then just writing gay, too gay next to it, basically. Like, they had to kind of ungay it slightly for the film. But even then, apparently there was some southern states and cities in the US that didn't screen rope. Like, it didn't do very well because people found it too much in 1948, which is amazing.
And that's the thing. That's what I mean when I say it doesn't age well, is that it's not the same impact now that it would have been. We can't experience it in the same way. And and I also feel like I should go back and slightly address something that Hitchcock was kind of a bonus bastard to women, but like, I don't want to get him off the hook. I see, he didn't treat everyone necessarily equally. He was also an extra bastard to women, but
he certainly was. Yes. Yes.
But yeah, and it's kind of a similar thing, I think, for Rear Window, where the visual spectacle of looking into other people's windows and seeing what he's seeing isn't as scandalous now as it was then. Like, you know, seeing a man getting drunk and a woman entertaining several men, and another woman being sad and people sleeping outdoors. Like, all of this was meant to be like slightly scandalous, like salacious. Right. And it just seems like quite sweet and rated G to us now. Like, there's a bit,
I know.
Like, it's all a bit.
It's so true. And that's right. It's those little things that he was one of the first people to do, this idea of kind of looking in. It's a very David Lynch thing too, like this kind of looking in behind closed curtains and what's really going on your neighbours' homes. And that opening shot of Rope where we were out on street level, I think that's where you see the Hitchcock cameo. He's like walking down the street and then the camera glides into the closed curtains and then we see what's going on in the dark, that this murder / gay sex has just happened, right? And it's the same with Psycho. I think Psycho opens with us peeking in through a window and Janet Leigh is in her bra and she's just had an extramarital affair with a married guy. So yeah, like he's obsessed with that kind of thing, isn't it? Like, kind of like shocking. What are the shocking goings on happening behind closed curtains?
Don't.
Got to see if there's
I know. But not just yet. Let's stay this way for a minute.
Let's talk about that general kind of setup and that sustained Hitchcockian tension in this movie, right? Because I think it's one of the perfect examples of that classic, bomb under the table theory that Hitchcock had, which is, audiences will be much more tense if you show them that there is a bomb under the table where people are dining, so you know that they're in danger, even if the characters don't know it, right? So rather than surprise, show the danger. And this is this film almost literally, right? We've got a body under the table that is hidden throughout this entire movie, and so what we get is this sustained tension, right, but also kind of skewed morals where we almost find ourselves rooting for these two sociopaths. Like, we want them to get away with it. We don't want that body to be discovered.
We sort of know that their hubris is going to get them in the end. We know it's going to be one step too far, and we see James Stewart, who plays James Jimmy Stewart, who plays their former schoolmaster, who's now a publisher, who they've invited because they think he would understand and because they think he's clever enough that if anyone can figure it out, he will. So that's the tension isn't really if they'll find out so much as when are they going to find out, which I feel is what the audience identifies with these protagonist murderers. Because Philip and Brandon are going through the same thing as we are. They're wondering, is he going to get it? Are they going to figure it out? How close can they get to the sun without Daedalus's wings melting off?
Yeah.
You know, it's this real, they say it themselves, cat and mouse. And that's Hitchcock. He knows how to push it back and forth just enough for it to unravel, but to unravel slowly and at the right time.
It's so good, isn't it? It's kind of masterfully handled, I think, because it sort of feels like, and we'll get back into the camera work in a minute, but obviously it feels like we're watching something in real time. Of course, we're not quite. Like, it's clever because he's kind of pulled a clever trick on us again, because it would be much longer than just 90 minutes, right? This entire dinner party. It's like we see this entire dinner party play out. We see the guests come and then go at the end of the night. It's gotten dark by the time it finishes. So it's kind of like a sped up reality in a weird way, isn't it? Even though it feels like we've lived through that whole evening with them, you know?
Yeah, and I see a lot written about this that talks about something like it would really be 180 minutes, even though it's a 110-minute film, this kind of thing. And it's interesting because I think it's referred to as sped up a lot, but I think it's more ellipses. Like, I think he uses the wandering camera to jump forward in the evening between conversations.
Sure. But he does it very seamlessly, where you're not consciously
100%.
You're not consciously aware of those time jumps, are you? Which is amazing.
Like, you never really see them eat dinner and then they're done with dinner.
Right.
And it's sort of like, oh, but I know they talked about, and it's so great because it's got this wonderful fat shaming comment to remind us that no, we definitely saw them eating the pate because after their cook housekeeper wanted to get this fantastic pate for Jimmy Stewart, she shames the only young woman eating it and says that mind the calories, darling. And it's like, wow, okay. Like,
so classic.
And that's
so
what Hitchcock
classic.
thinks of women, you know? Like, there you go.
There we go. What do you think of the one take kind of, you know, gimmick, almost, you could call it, right? I mean, like, obviously he wanted it to look like one huge, long, continuous take. At the time, obviously, film reels, you could only shoot for so many minutes. So he has to have these kind of hidden cuts, right? Where we will, like, cross behind somebody's back, or you'll kind of, like, close up onto, like, a sort of flat surface so that he can make these subtle cuts. Do you find that distracting? Are you kind of looking for the cuts? Does that take you out of it at all, or the opposite?
There's one or two that I always notice. Like, there's one that fades into Brandon or Philip's back and then fades back out. That is always really noticeable. But generally speaking, I think they actually disappear quite nicely. Because of digital camera, we're not as limited with those takes, but there are still limits at whatever resolution. And certainly if you wanted to shoot film, there's still pretty standard is only 1,000-foot mags and this kind of stuff. But I think that because Hitchcock needed to prove that this would work as a cinematic language, he's really doing his detail conscientious filmmaking. And I think the spectacle of a single shot, the choreography of a single shot, is a heck of a lot easier than the justification of a single shot.
Yes.
And that's what Hitchcock does really, really well in this film, is he justifies what his camera is looking at. There's not an inch of wasted sight. Whereas I think the mistake a lot of people make is they get the choreography right, but they don't get the content of the frame is right.
Completely agree with you. I think that, like, you know, the one that always comes to mind for me is Birdman, which, like, I didn't dislike Birdman, but I did find that it was just a little bit smug with itself, where it was like, look, we're doing this in one take, but you don't really know what's the point of it being, or it's not in one take, but what's the point of it looking like it's in one take? Like, it didn't really feel like it was adding anything for me in that particular film. Like, it's a little bit of a style over substance thing. Like you said, it's not about the content. It's about, look, we're doing a one take, aren't we clever kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think the only other one take that really sticks out in my mind is being important, and I'm sure there's others, but is it Goodfellas when he goes down into the club?
Oh yeah, that's awesome. Yeah,
like that makes sense because you're seeing this guy, it's telling you he's a smooth operator. You are following one character, so it makes sense. They're going through multiple environments. It's beautifully executed. You're introducing tons of characters. Again, every inch of that shot is valid. But yeah, I think that's the thing where a lot of these fall down, is that people get so obsessed with figuring out if they can do it, they don't stop to think whether they should.
Exactly. And I think it works for this movie because we are never let off the hook. Like, we are never given respite from being in this claustrophobic environment with this dead body in front of us, right? And it's like it's kind of like a magic trick. It's like we'll never come away from this. Like, you are stuck in this flat with this dead body, and it's just sustained tension for 110 minutes in that regard, isn't it? You know?
Exactly. Hitchcock, the king of edging.
It's edging the movie, right?
It is. It really is. But again, you know, he is using cinematic language effectively to manipulate his audience exactly how he wants to. And if that isn't successful filmmaking, I don't know what is.
And these things that you mentioned earlier, right, that it was hard to do. It was hard to pull off, not only because they had to find a way to kind of subtly cover the takes so that they could change the film reels, but also we're on a soundstage, right? We're not in a real apartment in Manhattan. We're on a big soundstage. The camera itself was on wheels, and it was big and cumbersome at the time, so they had to like pull walls apart when the camera went through doorways. There was constantly a team of people that were sort of moving furniture around on wheels behind the camera, right, as they made this whole thing look seamless and natural. It's very cool.
Absolutely. And it reminds me, there's a great shot in Confessions of a Dangerous Mind where he's walking around the television studio and it changes eras, and they do a similar thing where they're flying in walls and out really seamlessly and moving in extras and location and production design, and those kind of shots are absolutely spectacular. And again, a lot of times it ends up being substance over style over substance. But with Hitchcock, he could back it up. You know, he had the receipts, and it really does work. I was fascinated, and one of the things looking at the production design I wanted to learn more about is apparently there were like 7 or 8 different rounds of clouds, and they were spun glass.
Yes.
And that's how they kept the light so beautifully. And I don't know if that means, like, does that mean they were made of fiberglass? Because that kind of makes sense. They were fiberglass.
Yeah, they were fiberglass.
Yeah, and that's just so poisonous. But also, I'm so grateful that they did it before they figured out it was poisonous, because it's gorgeous. So like,
it is absolutely gorgeous. Like, this is what stops this, because I think, you know, sometimes movies based on plays in one location can feel quote unquote stagey, right? But this film never. It feels so cinematic because of all those beautiful visual things that he adds in, that like skyline in the background and the clouds, like you said, that are slowly changing, and the light is going down, the sunset in the background, the neon green and red lights flashing in through the window from like the, I guess, like sort of Broadway theaters or something, I don't know, but like everything happening even in the background outside of our window it just looks amazing, doesn't it? And it was all created.
Exactly. It's that even we're in one location, the location evolves. It evolves through lighting. It evolves through characters who come in and out. It evolves through things that are brought in. So even though it is a static location, he finds ways of giving it novelty and space. It reminds me of what's it called? The underground Five Girls Go Camping.
The
Scary
Descent.
Underground people. The Descent. Yeah. It reminds me of in The Descent, where they give each of the leads a different kind of light source, so that you, even though you're in this space that doesn't necessarily change, you're having novelty and storytelling through other aspects of the mise en scène.
Exactly that. It just makes it pop off the screen that little bit more, right? And It's a really fun production design too, you know, speaking of the home and, you know, the domestic setting. I love these little moments where, like, there's that door to the kitchen that kind of flips open and closed, and Hitchcock again must it's so detailed, like choreographs these tricks where every time that door just happens to flip open, we see a character doing something important before the door quickly closes again.
The drawer.
Like again, like how meticulously must this have been rehearsed? It's amazing.
Well, and it's finding ways, and using mirrors and that kind of stuff. It's finding ways of bringing novelty to that static frame and bringing reveals to that static frame again. So your eye is unblinking. It's single takes, but he's finding ways to evolve it, which is really clever.
Let's talk about these characters then. We've got Brandon and Philip as our murderous gay couple at the center of this, right? What do you think of these two? They're sort of our protagonists, right? They're sort of the ones who we as the audience are sort of aligned with from beginning to end, but they're also sociopaths, right? Like, what do you think of them?
You know what? I think the simplicity of his stories and his characters serves the complex nature of how he tells the stories.
Yeah.
I don't think they're that complex as characters go. It's they want to prove themselves, but they need other people's they want to prove themselves and they need other people's approval, and they sort of want to exist with it and without it at the same time, and that drives them very basically to their end. They're sort of those villains who explain exactly how they did it in the seconds before the hero dies, and then he leaps from the table and wins. But it's fine. They don't need to be like deeply layered, characters for this to work. And in fact, it sort of suits us that they aren't, because they exist as sort of characters and tropes and, stand-ins for people the audience believe could exist, rather than fully formed, depthful personas.
Yeah, totally. And again, like how much this is kind of Hitchcock's own perspectives, or if this is just a coincidence, but a lot of he does have a lot of queer coded characters in his films, but they all tend to be villains. They tend to be the baddies, right? So whether it's Rope, whether it's Strangers on a Train, whether it's even Norman Bates, like the queer coded characters tend to also be the homicidal maniacs a lot of the time.
And I feel like it's not. And it doesn't necessarily feel like homophobia, but it feels like the othering of queerness.
It's othering, exactly. Yeah. No, totally.
You could just as easily imagine them being space aliens as being queer coded. Like, it's sort of outsider and it's interesting the way he does it, because it doesn't feel so disassociating, but then when you look at it as a work as a whole, as an oeuvre, it's like, why the bad guy gotta be gay? Like, what's that about?
always with like a slightly creepy relationship to their own mother, exactly, it's all the stereotypes. Exactly. But having said that, they're also often the most fun. They're the best characters and the most interesting characters. Like, I think they're so much more interesting often, and they give the performers so much more stuff to do than the kind of all-American good guy, Cary Grant, James Stewart type heroes that he puts in the center of his films as well, Like, they're much more interesting and they have more going on, a bit more depth,
Absolutely. And I'm sure Cary Grant has played a sinister bad guy at least once or twice, even if not in Hitchcock. But I don't think Jimmy Stewart has ever played a bastard.
No, I mean, Vertigo, he's sort of on the verge of, he's got some creepy stuff going on, but I think the film still kind of frames him as a good guy, which is also a bit weird, but
absolutely.
But no, I think they're great. I think John Dahl, particularly as Brandon, the kind of really charismatic one of the two, I think he's so good in this film, really kind of holds it together with just how much kind of, because obviously Farley Granger's character Philip is kind of constantly freaking out and he's like, oh my God, but like Brandon is just like, it'll be fine, Philip. It'll be fine. Just have a drink. Like, and he is literally getting off on this scenario, I think, isn't he?
He's sort of proto Patrick Bateman, American Psycho. Thinks his above everything and will always come out on top so he can push the envelope as far as he wants to. And it's interesting because the second he realizes he's stepped over the edge and is falling and can't get back up, he does, the veneer cracks, so we see his panic underneath. He is just like Philip. The the confidence was only there until it wasn't, kind of a thing.
Totally. And I think what's really interesting watching it a few times now and noticing it's actually Philip that is doing the murders. So the kind of like slightly more Brandon is sort of all talk and bravura, right? But you actually see Philip with the rope killing, and they talk about how Philip was the one that used to quote unquote choke chickens. And he's the one at the end that kind of freaks out with the gun as well. And like you in some ways I feel like, is Philip actually the more dangerous, unhinged one here? Because you just feel like he's on the verge of snapping like throughout this entire movie, whereas Brandon is just kind of keeping his shit together and he's all talk in a way.
Yeah. I feel like Brandon, the idea is that they got the gist for the Uberman. There are people who should be allowed to do murders and people who shouldn't, that they got this idea from Jimmy Stewart when they were in school. And that they've now run with it, and that Brendan has decided they're going to do this now. Yeah. And I think he doth protest too much as well, because he keeps saying, I don't think so-and-so would have gone through with it. I don't think so-and-so would have gone through with it. And in fact, he didn't do anything. And he's now sort of, I did do this murder, and maybe you'll catch me. So, and as you say, Philip, who is the one who chokes chickens and cuts his hand and, all this other kind of micro, unhinged gestures. He's the one who actually had the rope twisted around David's neck, and was pulling the last bits of life out of him. And Brandon was a bystander. He experienced it. He felt the life go out of David, but he didn't have the power of doing it. And there's almost a sense that in order to prove he was part of it, he needs to be caught having been responsible for it.
Yeah, totally. And you mentioned this like Ubermensch kind of thread here going on, right? And this comes from like a sort of a Nietzsche kind of philosophy, right? That obviously the Nazis really were really
took and ran with,
exactly. And I think this movie does a really interesting thing of kind of, again, it feels quite ahead of its time. There's this idea of privilege and toxic masculinity and these Harvard rich boys who literally feel like they can get away with anything, that they're above the law, right? It's this idea that there are certain men, these kind of supermen, these Ubermensch, who are sort of above societal kind of sort of rules and laws and that kind of thing, and can take the lives of people that are considered beneath them with no consequences.
And isn't it great that no one thinks that way anymore? Oh dear.
Yeah, I know. I just kept thinking of people like, well, there's a million and one.
Every politician ever.
Every politician, or people like Brett Kavanaugh. Like even you see it and hear it so much. These kind of like rich, privileged dudes that always manage to get away with things and have absolutely no consideration. It is a scary philosophy that still very much exists, right? And I think that is what I find really creepy at the center of this film, is that thing that they really truly believe, and that they got taught by their teacher, Jimmy Stewart, as well, which is quite a weird thing, because Jimmy Stewart kind of comes in as sort of the hero to kind of
sneaking it in on the nice face of Jimmy Stewart,
right? But also, like, he was the one that was kind of into this philosophy too, right? That sort of taught them it back in the day.
But I'd never do it. Never do it.
Yeah. There's that great speech he gives though midway through the film, sort of for a joke, right? But he talks about death by strangulation or slow torture and all that stuff about how he would murder certain
hotel
people.
Employees would be death by slow torture. It's like, you have spent a lot of time thinking about this, my friend.
Careful application of the trigger finger on a pair of seats in the first row is yours for the shooting. And have you had any difficulty in getting into our Velvet Rope restaurant?
Frightful.
A very simple matter. A flick of the knife, madame. And if you'll kindly step this way. Step over the head waiter's body. Thank you. And here's your table.
Rupert, you're the end.
There's a hotel clerk I could cheerfully flick a knife at.
Oh, no, sorry. Knives may not be used on hotel employees. They are in the death by slow torture category.
Oh.
Along with bird lovers, small children, and tap dancers.
I love it. It's so good.
Rolls too trippingly off the tongue.
I know, but it's in that regard, this film's kind of aged creepily well, hasn't it? I think, thematically.
Well, and I think too, I for one am here for the revolution. I welcome the coming overthrowing of our capitalistic overlords.
Yes.
But it's very clear that there are people out there who think this way, and I think they're all Brandons or Phillips in the end, where they want to prove so greatly that they are above the rest, that they do these horrible things that surely they could only do if they were above the rest, but they're just horrible things done by horrible people who are no better than anyone else. And it's nice that that's the conclusion that's drawn here.
Yeah.
Because it could go other directions.
Totally. And Jimmy Stewart has gone on the record and sort of said that he didn't love this film either, and that he thought he was miscast. And I think in the play, this character is supposed to be a bit more sinister and a bit more like Brandon. I think he's supposed to take a bit more glee in this philosophy, even though he eventually kind of is like, well, I didn't actually mean it at the end. But he's supposed to be this guy that, Brandon and Philip are almost supposed to be a bit scared by or intimidated by. And I'm not sure whether I'm not sure if this was quite the right role for Jimmy Stewart in a way, because he's a little bit too like all-American nice guy,
Yeah, I think he gets there in the end. He connects their tension of being discovered, which I think becomes his purpose as a character. I think the intimidation comes from his cleverness and the potential to figure them out, rather than from his nature as an intimidating character.
Yeah.
Although I do love the line, and I will be stealing it, that he says, "Oh, you must be so-and-so. Brendan told me all about you." And she says, "Did he do me justice?" And Stewart says, "Do you deserve justice?" And it's like, boom, coming in with the like, "Hi, nice to meet you. Do you deserve justice?" Keeping it light at the dinner party. So...
It's so good. It's so good.
Justice?
What do you think of these moments of classic Hitchcockian tension? Like, the thing that I always think of is that brilliant moment where the sort of maid character is clearing the table, right? Like, that's such a great moment, isn't it? As you see her kind of slowly and methodically kind of remove everything piece by piece, and she comes like this close to opening the chest and discovering the body before somebody swoops in. But I love those kind of sustained moments in this film.
It is, I mean, it's his bread and butter, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think you probably have to be a bit of a bastard to work people until they get those things exactly right. So, I think that, I've said it before, that sometimes it takes monsters to realize monstrous things. And I think if he didn't enjoy making people cringe, if he didn't feel he knew he was in the right enough to exact these really harsh, lots of takes, lots of exhausting precision rehearsals, then we wouldn't have these films that take that to create them. Perhaps it is we who are the monsters for demanding such content.
Yes. Indeed.
But yeah,
that's
there
it.
You go.
I think that's it. He makes us realize that in ourselves, that we all kind of love watching quite monstrous things, or people do monstrous things, right? It's the reason we like horror. It's the reason we like Hitchcock movies, is that we kind of play out these kind of wickedly evil scenarios and really enjoy them, right? And kind of get off on them. Hitchcock gets off on this kind of thing.
That perhaps we're all suffering from some kind of universal PTSD, and we find comfort in reliving these horrible things in safe environments. Yeah,
exactly.
It's it's bonkers. It's bonkers.
And I'm always a fan, and this is the other thing that runs alongside every film I'm doing in this series, which is I'm a fan of the awkward dinner party as a subgenre of horror, right? Like all the way through to movies like The Invitation, Speak No Evil. Like, these films are just where you get a bunch of people together in a house or an apartment, and you just want to cringe yourself to death for some kind of reason, right? As well, and this feels very much of that.
Absolutely,
well.
Yeah. I do feel like as an adult, I thought there was going to be lots more quicksand and lots more awkward dinner parties based on my childhood viewings.
Yeah.
What's it all about, Philip?
What's what all about? Now stop playing crime and punishment, Rupert. You want to know something? Come out with it. Otherwise...
Oh, no, temper. Now, don't stop.
I'd like a drink.
Oh, wait, I'll get it for you. Now, keep playing. What would you like, scotch?
No, brandy.
Rope is unbelievably 75 years old this year, which to me is just like absolutely baffling. How do you think, Jen, this film kind of holds up 75 years on?
I think it's a fantastic experience. I think it bears rewatching over and over again. I think there's a reason it was put in the Library of Congress. There's a reason it's on so many top lists. It's fundamental watching, and it's easy to watch. So I think it's one of those films that can easily be dismissed as oh, isn't that like a really artsy film? It's not. It's it's a bit of fun. So I just highly recommend people watch it and judge for themselves. But yeah, I think it holds up perfectly well, even if some of the contexts have changed as cultural touchstones for our audiences.
Yeah. Completely agree. Completely. I mean, I love this film. For me, this is a masterpiece. This is top 5 Hitchcock's. There's nothing about it I don't love from beginning to end. Like the pacing, the camera work, the staging, the set design, the characters, the performances, the tension. It's all here for me. Absolutely one of his best. But Jen, we should move on because we've got another Hitchcock masterpiece to discuss, right? So let's get into Rear Window from 1954.
Precinct 6, Sergeant Allgood.
Hello. Look, a man is assaulting a woman at 125 West 9th Street, second floor, at the rear. No, make it fast. L.B. Jeffries.
Phone number?
Chelsea 25598.
So Rear Window's fantastic. We've got a captive protagonist again in Jimmy Stewart, who is a travel or a journalist war photographer who has been all over the world and has broken his leg doing exciting things. So he's stuck in his flat, where his only view is the back courtyard that he shares with many other citizens of Lower Manhattan. His only visitors are his insurance-assigned nurse and his girlfriend, who is the very stylish socialite. And my God, her dresses are so good all the way through this film, as per.
Unbelievable.
And as he's peeping on his neighbors and he sees the various details of their lives unfold, he witnesses what he believes to be a murder. And so the film is, again, not a whodunit, and not an if, not a how did they do it, but an if they did it.
Exactly that.
Which is quite fun.
What do you think of this film, Jen? What do you think of it? It's generally considered one of the greatest films ever made. It was in Sight and Sound's top, 100 movies poll recently. I think number 38. It's like always considered one of the great masterpieces of cinema. Do you agree?
I mean, yes, of course it is. It's a no-brainer. Like, it's not controversial that this film is amazing. Like, it really isn't.
It's so true. It is. I mean, I really don't think I could think of... I don't know if it's my personal favourite, but I don't think I could think of a single fault in this film. Like, I think everything is perfect in this movie, Yeah,
it's, again, he's 6 years on from Rope, 7 years on from Rope. He's been experimenting the whole time. He's not one to rest on his laurels. He keeps trying new things. He keeps developing relationships with new and better actors. And I think the casting in this film is one of the things that makes it spectacular. Every inch of performance is filled with subtext, as per. And yeah, he uses his swing at the studio to build one of their largest sets ever that accommodates drainage for rain and all these effects and everything else.
I love
climbing
the set
on
so
and
much.
Everything.
It's just, I just love the fact that it's a set. Like, I don't know, there's something even more magical about that than if it was shot on location, right? Just this whole courtyard, all those apartments, all those windows, like you said, the skyline, the rain. It's unbelievable, isn't it, that was all just created in this soundstage for Hitchcock. It's just so cool. I love just watching it, And
especially because we only ever see into these homes in miniature. There's a great break at the end when we finally get out of the apartment for a moment, but we only ever get into the courtyard. We never go into their homes. And so all of these homes, I imagine that the wall facing Stewart's window in each flat is just like white, that it's just completely undesigned, because we never see it.
It's got like script pages and shooting schedules.
Exactly, like choreography notes on it, and there's like script supervisors squeezed between two windows, like shouting direction,
call sheets and stuff.
Exactly. They use that one as a production office when they're not shooting that way.
Totally.
But you know, it's funny. I just realized now in this conversation that I always sort of picture them as miniatures, but obviously they were these full-sized apartments and buildings, and not the sort of shown in miniature as we see them filmed through Jimmy Stewart's binoculars. You know.
Oh, I know you're right, because you're right. Apart from that very last 2 minutes, everything we see is the camera is placed where Jimmy Stewart is, right? So everything we see is just that from that one angle as the camera kind of swoops from window to window. So we get this kind of restricted view, but it's one we all recognize, right? I mean, come on, we've all been there, especially during lockdown. You might have a look you look out your window and check out what your neighbors are up to, right? There's that kind of urge in all of us, I think. You know?
I genuinely, there's a thing that sticks. So whenever I look out my back window, I think of this movie, and then I think of something I once heard a private detective say when someone asked him, you know, what advice can you give people as a private detective? And he just said, never have your curtains open. And that just always sticks in my head as sort of because I think it invites the question, as many people as you might be watching, who's watching you? Who is watching the watcher?
Exactly.
And I think that's great. I don't think Hitchcock ever fully turned his hand to that concept. I think he probably would have liked to, but I do think it invites us to consider it.
Totally. It would have enjoyed it in this day and age too, with webcams, right? You know, I know a lot of people that constantly always have something over their camera, even when it's quote unquote off, right? Because you never quite know these days. And there's that extra layer of being watched now in our day-to-day lives, that I think the fact that we all have cameras on us 24/7, you know, and this movie kind of makes me think of that too, you know, just this idea that you're always being watched.
Absolutely. And I'm one of those people who put stickers over my cameras. My brother works in computer security, and it became very clear to me very early on that if you have a cell phone in the room, then people can see and hear you. And that's just the way it is. So
it's awful.
You know, either don't do anything you don't want to be seen or heard, or leave your cell phone in another room and then be sure there's not another camera. Jesus. I was doing rehearsals in this school cafeteria the other day, and we suddenly realized that there was a webcam in the corner of the room, and we were like, oh, it's obviously just because they're keeping an eye on the kids during the school day, but we actually have to cover that up because some of our rehearsals are closed sets, and it's we just take for granted privacy, and it doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist, exactly. And this movie kind of gets to that so cleverly, doesn't it? I think, yeah. And I love this idea that you really, even though really we have 2 to 3 characters in this film that we really spend time with and get to know, you do get a sense of character of all the other people in this building, right? I love that. I love that you get an insight into, you know, Miss Lonely Hearts, and there's obviously the guy who murders his wife, but there's also the woman that's always entertaining all the different men coming and going, and the couple that are on their honeymoon. And, you know, I love that it gives us little snapshots into all these different lives happening as well, you know?
Well, and I couldn't figure out the guys. Is it the ones who are sleeping outdoors are meant to be on Newlyweds, right? Is that the idea? I could never quite figure that out.
I think they're different. So there's the newlyweds that keep closing the curtains, you know.
Those are the newlyweds. But then who are the ones who are sleeping outdoors? I know they own the dog, but I can't figure for the life of me why they're sleeping outdoors.
I think it's just because it's supposed to be the hottest ever summer, right? You know, it's supposed to be this really hot, sweaty summer. So they take their mattress out onto their balcony. Me and Rihanna were watching it, and we were like, oh, that actually looks we should do that sometime. That looks quite nice, you know? Have a little
it's one of those
sleep.
Things.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that I feel like the writer has never lived in one of these apartments before, and it's just and they put the mattress on the balcony, and it's can you what?
I know.
And with the alarm clock on it and everything else. But yeah, no, it is, and it's these little vignettes that we get are quite interesting and quotidian, and
yeah,
you know, it is like a bit of gossip, which we all love, that insider information and that sort of treat of being invited into a secret. But yeah, it very quickly bites him on the ass. I do like as well that it's be careful what you want to look at. It could get you killed.
I know. And there is something at play here, isn't there, about marriage? We see, constantly Jimmy Stewart is being pressured into potentially marrying this woman played by Grace Kelly, or considering it or not wanting to consider it. And then you've got the newlyweds at one stage of marriage. You've got the other couple that are at the kind of murderous stage of marriage. You've got, this woman whose husband is away a lot and she's entertaining these other men. And you've got this other woman who is perpetually single that they call Miss Lonely Hearts, which is really sad. And, there is something at play here as well about men and women and relationships and romance and marriage and all of that kind of thing. It's all like different layers of that happening at the same time, it feels like.
It's a really funny one next to Rope, because not only is this all about like heterosexual relationships and an area of queer folk to be spotted, but also the characters have arcs and wants and needs outside of the narrative of the film, which was sort of absent in Rope. In Rope, it's very much centered about what's happening, and that's very related to their internal journeys. But here we've got Grace Kelly, who wants to marry Jimmy Stewart, but she needs to prove that she can be with him to him. Yeah. And you've got Jimmy Stewart, who wants to be with her but needs to protect her. Yeah. And you see that really play out in their dynamic within the narrative. It is an A story and a B story as opposed to just the A story of Rope. I think you're right. I think that's why it's so satisfying, isn't it, as a film, because you it's not just about that murder happening across the courtyard. Like, there's other stuff going on here and interesting dynamics at play between him and Grace Kelly throughout. And in some ways, they're set up as so stereotypical man and woman, right? He travels around and he's a war photographer, and he's really kind of like, his job involves a lot of kind of like physical stress and that kind of thing, whereas she goes to glamorous parties and wears beautiful dresses and, this kind of thing. And that's kind of where the tension is at the beginning, that he thinks they'll never work as a long-term couple for this reason. But then, of course, he is kind of made impotent, right, in this movie, and she's the one that's kind of climbing up, sneaking into the apartment. She's doing all the heroics in this film as well, so it's kind of interesting the way they subvert that slowly throughout the movie. Well, I think the reason she's doing those heroics, though, is to prove to Jimmy Stewart that they should be together. I think if he said, yes, darling, I'll marry you, she never would have gone out there and climbed up the balcony and into Thorwald's apartment. I think that it is her want for him to see her as a desirable mate that drives her to prove herself to him through these, quite frankly, irresponsible judgment calls.
Yeah, you're right. But what do you think of Grace Kelly generally as a performer and her character in this? Because I do think that she's really fun and really interesting, and there's more to her than just being the kind of glamorous blonde wife or love interest, I suppose. But what do you think?
Oh, I love her. Like, I'm not sure I can speak without bias, because I'm deeply, deeply in love with Grace Kelly. Like, everything she's ever in, I would watch forever.
She's ridiculously beautiful, isn't she? Like, it's unbelievable.
Like she doesn't look real,
right? And
in her clothing, she doesn't look real, and the way she moves and the way she talks, and in an age before VFX and Photoshop, and and it's just she is Grace personified on the screen, and it's hard to not just be enveloped in her charisma whenever she comes on.
Yeah, exactly that. I think she adds something anyway to this. She's also funny. She's got a sense of humor. Like, she's genuinely a great actress. Like, I think she's ridiculously the whole package, isn't she? And particularly in this movie, and the chemistry between Jimmy Stewart was mid-40s, she was mid-20s. He was a lot older than her when they were shooting this, and part of me thinks she could do better than this guy. But anyway, but they have good chemistry together, don't they? They're great.
Oh, but I think she could have chemistry with a Formica countertop. Like, and I'm not wrong, isn't she like the Princess of Monaco or something as well? Like, she's legit royalty, and she's really good at on screen. I have no idea what she was like as a human being. I like to think that that she was loveliness incarnate, and I'm not going to look into it because I don't want that dispelled. But
no, I think she was. And also, she reportedly had a really good relationship with Hitchcock. They got on really well as friends. It wasn't that difficult, more abusive relationship that he had with Tippi Hedren later on, for example. Like, I think these two genuinely, she had nice things to say about him as a collaborator and as a filmmaker, you know?
I don't think Hitchcock believed he was being a bastard. I think he just treated people the way that he enjoyed treating them. And if he got away with it, he got away with it. And if he didn't, he didn't.
Yeah, maybe. And I think definitely, you know, Hitchcock obviously had this thing where he was such a technical filmmaker and he was very precise. And I think he thought of actors as his props that he could move around and put in the frame and dress how he needed to dress them and move in the way he needed. Yeah, you know, in the way that Kubrick took and ran with, I think, even more so, you know. I think
and Tarantino to some extent.
And Tarantino, exactly. Yeah. These kind of control freak directors, to be honest, right? They've got a bad reputation in terms of the way they treat actors, and particularly, obviously, the way they treat women actors. You know, like that, even more so.
It's almost absent of morality, but
yeah,
in his mind, it's absent of morality. In our mind, we can see it's amoral.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, exactly.
Or immoral. Yeah.
So yeah, it's all of that is kind of really interesting. But these two do have amazing chemistry throughout, and I also love the woman. Is it Stella? Yes, Stella, played by Thelma Ritter, who comes over like his nurse kind of character, right? Who is also brilliant in this movie, I think.
If she's not John Ritter's mom, I'll eat my shoe. But yeah, no, she's spectacular and brings it a really good, sensible balance to the sort of frivolousness of Stuart and Grace in this one.
Yeah, totally. And also there's the marriage thing too. Like, she talks about she's at the end of she's been married for however many decades and she's come from that slightly different generation and perspective. But again, there's that talk of marriage and being with somebody and marriage dynamics and all of that kind of she brings insight to as well in an interesting way. Yeah,
absolutely. And you know, it interests me that Hitchcock is someone who had the appearance of a happy marriage without having a happy marriage, was sort of able to, you know, he doesn't depict a rich marriage of equals, does he? It's just sort of like a play of a happy marriage. It's sort of like a stand-up comedian's jokes about a happy marriage, or sort of what he portrays.
Exactly that. Yeah, you're right. So what do you think of it? Can you see Hitch's direction having kind of evolved and graduated from Rope, for example? I mean, actually, one of the things that my guest last week, Alexandra Heller-Nicholas, mentioned when we talked about Dial M for Murder is that you could almost take these three films, Rope first, then Dial M in the middle, and then this, as a kind of almost apartment trilogy that he's made. And it feels like each one kind of experimenting in different ways and arriving fully formed at Rear Window, right, as this kind of perfect encapsulation of this kind of apartment thriller, I suppose, right? But do you kind of feel that the way that his filmmaking has matured or evolved since Rope?
Oh yeah, for sure. But I think that's what he does, is he experiments and he absorbs the information and he evolves. You know, I think he's a director who never forgets a lesson he learns, and that he learns a lot of lessons along the way, and that he's so fastidious in everything he does, he can't help but absorb it and sort of bring those experiences into his toolbox. So 100%, I think he's better at directing actors. I think he understands close-ups better. I think he understands 360 filming better. I think he understands lighting better. I think there's so many ways that you can see he's evolved in this film and is using further tools to tell his story than he was previously. And then you know, exactly like Alexandra says, stepping forward into his films after this as well.
Yeah, and I think this almost feels like the quintessential Hitchcock film. You know, like if I was to show somebody who never knew anything about Hitchcock a Hitchcock film, it feels like this is like the full bingo card of Hitchcock, right? You know, like you've got the voyeurism, you've got the sustained tension, the murder, the mystery, you've got the beautiful blonde, you've got the Jimmy Stewart hero, you've got the comedy, the romance, you know, like it feels like it's the complete set of all Hitchcockian tropes in this movie.
You know what it is? I think he nails his brand at this point.
Yeah.
I think, you know, he is a marketer as much as he is a storyteller, as much as he's a filmmaker. And it's that sort of Barnum and Bailey, you know, rock up thing. And I think it's because he understands what audiences want to see from him and what he can most easily get to them through the studios and with the resources he has. Because it It'd be interesting to see the evolution of his innovation at this point as well, whether he slows and stays more with what he's become known for, if he continues to try and break out of that mold. Well, but yeah, I think it's branding at this point.
I think he did try to break out. I think like this feels to me around the mid-50s when he achieved his peak kind of mainstream Hollywood success. It's almost like this is as good as he can get. He as being like a mainstream Hollywood audience pleasing filmmaker, and then you see after this he goes even more experimental, weirder films. Vertigo, much more weird, experimental, sexual, sleazy. Psycho, like breaks all kinds of rules, black and white, cheap. Like I think it was almost like, yeah, I've done it. I've done Hollywood movies with Rear Window. It's like, so after this, he's sort of like, what's next? Like he's completed it. He's like completed mainstream.
Exactly. I did. I've done all of I've collected all the collectibles. I finished the boss level. I'm gonna put a new skin on it and play that way. Let's see what happens.
He's made the perfect thriller by this point, I think. So yeah. I mean, and let's talk about the thriller or horror aspects of it. Then, how do you find that in this particular film? The murderer himself, right? And the way that tension kind of builds up.
Builds up is the right word for it. If Rope is a constant journey of tension, this is like the fundamental slow burn.
Yeah, you're right.
Because it's. I think we get a sense of the forbidden from the second we see Stuart is spying on his neighbors, and we get a sort of reassurance of that from the scene that follows where the nurse is saying, oh, you shouldn't do that, you're naughty. And then Grace Kelly comes in and says, that's people always looking at each other when they ought to be looking at themselves. So we know what this is. Like, really early on, we know what this is.
Absolutely.
And we know what the rules are. We know what he's doing is sort of verboten and a bit forbidden, so there's this low key suspension there. And I would say too, music is doing a lot of work here. And I wanted to mention Rope. For those of you who do go back to Rope, listen to the score, because it really does an excellent job of giving you some notes that shouldn't be menacing and then immediately turning them menacing. And I think that's something that's going on in this film as well.
Well, actually on that note, that's a really interesting thing about both these films, right? Is that there is music, but it's all in-world music as well. That's the other thing. Like Rope has got those incredible moments when characters are playing the piano, and it adds those moments of punctuation, doesn't it? And it's the same in this. As far as I'm aware, apart from during the opening and closing credits, I don't think there's any just like normal score. I think it's all like music and sound design that we hear from the courtyard or whatever as well.
All diegetic.
So interesting, that, isn't it? Yeah.
I think, Rope has, aside the intros and outros as well, but yeah, it's a lot of it's diegetic music, whether it's the pianist composing something or someone's radio or someone singing or...
So good.
It's really a soundscape that's motivated. And I'm sure, I wager there's some strings or some drone in tone in there, but yeah, it's great, and it's the tension is an undercurrent from the beginning, but it really doesn't build until Grace Kelly goes into the apartment. That's really the first point that you're nervous. Everything else is just slow burn.
Such good tension, right? No matter how many times I watch this film, I am holding my breath during that moment when she sneaks into his apartment. Because again, like the point of view it lends us where we can see where he is in relation to her. We can see him getting closer. It's not so much playing the element of surprise as much as it is like he's showing us the bad guy is coming for her kind of thing. And I just love it so much. It works so well, I think, It's
that sort of shark fin approaching you. Like you know danger's coming even if you can't fully see it. And which is like classic human fear as well, which is again, his shtick. And
we don't get much insight into Thorwald as a character really, other than he's a wife murderer, because he almost seems like he's sort of panicking at times. He's just this kind of like regular douchey salesman who's trying to get away with something, isn't he, essentially? But there are some really sinister shots of him again. Like, I love that visual where he is sat in the dark and you just see his cigarette lit as he's like staring at us, you know? And then of course later that really famous moment when he spots Jimmy Stewart for the first time and again looks directly at us down the lens. Like he pulls off kind of sinister really well, I think, that
face.
actor.
Yeah. Well, and it's I think too, you know, I mentioned Hitchcock has really evolved his lighting technique in this film. He uses darkness and sort of, for lack of a better word, diegetic lighting, like on-camera lighting from, as you say, the glow of the cigar, the flash of Jimmy Stewart's bulb, the turning on and off of the lights in the apartments to conceal or expose. He's not just telling the story by lighting pretty pictures. He's using light to evolve a narrative, you know, as a narrative device to evolve the story.
God, this is it, right? Every element works, doesn't it? The sound design, the lighting, like it all just works so perfectly in this movie.
Yeah, and I would say too, the jewelry salesman thing, I question how much of that is clear in the narrative, if I'm honest, because we see the briefcase, and that might be something that has, again, aged badly with time. Maybe it would have been clear coding for the audience at the time that that's what he did. But I'm sure that when I first watched it, I would have thought he was a jewelry thief or something like that. Because why does anybody have all these huge jewels in their bag in a display box? And then when you read about the film, it says, and costume jewelry salesman.
Yes.
And it's like, do we know that? Is that clear from the storytelling?
I think at one point it's mentioned that he's a salesman, right? Because then Jimmy Stewart is like, well, why the hell would he be going out at night with his suitcase? What would he be selling at that time of night? But yes, you're right. Like, it's not, I think that's quite a dated thing, right? A door-to-door jewelry salesman is something that we're not very familiar with anymore.
Darling, the door-to-door costume jewelry salesman is here. What, at 3 a.m.? Yes, I thought it odd, but he does have some awfully nice things.
Yeah, and also it's so funny because, like you said at the beginning, you know, both these movies on the surface are pretty G-rated, family-friendly, but what's he doing? He's cut his wife into bits and is smuggling her body parts out in that tiny little suitcase bit by bit, right? It's so dark.
Well, so this is another thing I think reads slightly differently than my headcanon, which is that I think the suitcases he's taking away are her stuff, and then the case is her body.
Oh, that might be it. Yeah, that might be it. But then he has got, like, you see him with like a big saw, right?
Yeah,
well,
so we know.
Like
we know, and that's before we see that the workmen take away the case as well. So I think that might be why because it doesn't make sense where he's taking. It doesn't make sense a little bit, to be honest, and that's where I think, again, it's funny the slack that we cut for Hitchcock on some small details making sense, and it's like, I'm just not going to investigate it. And he did have, it was either Hitchcock or Wilder who had a thing, I think it may be Wilder actually, but who had a thing called refrigerator door moments, which is the one that you're watching the film, and as long as it doesn't bother you until you get home and open the refrigerator, then it's fine.
I agreed. And also, you can give it a free pass in that we're only getting snapshots of what's going on from James Stewart's perspective.
They don't.
Right?
They don't decide that we know. So
no, the point is we're watching this obscured version of what's happening from this guy's perspective, and there are times when he falls asleep during certain critical moments, right? Or he misses certain things because they happen behind closed curtains. Because also, I was always a bit unclear about who and what was buried in the garden,
or if anything, exactly.
Yeah. But I think it's okay. I think for me, I give it a pass because I feel like, well, we're piecing it together ourselves, like we are detectives too, like James Stewart, you know, from our windows.
Absolutely, I'll go with that, because if they sat down and said, well, this is A, B, C, and a D, and it still didn't fit in, then I'd query it. But you're absolutely right. It only ever gives us bits and pieces that we're meant to fill in the gaps on. And whether or not Stewart is right in all of his observations, or whether he's only right in the murder,
yes,
it sort of doesn't matter, because the fact is the story unfolds as it does.
And finally, you know, we touched upon James Stewart a few times, but What do you think of him in this movie? You know, it feels like this is much more a role designed for him than his character in Rope, for example. Like, he feels a little bit more at home here. But what do you think of him?
Yeah, but I think you know, he's 6 years on in his craft. Hitchcock's 6 years on. They've worked together. They know each other better. I think it's just, you know, he's evolved as all of it has. You know, you don't get those sort of fantastic medium close-ups in Rope that you get in this. You don't get the sort of hero shots with beautiful lighting in Rope that you get with this. So he's a movie star now, and I think it shows.
Totally. Him and Grace Kelly together, right? Absolute stars in this movie. And you're right, like the way they're framed and presented gives us that impression from the beginning. Yeah, it's so true. Well, there you go. And then finally, what do you think of that moment at the end? Like, I always love that kind of, it's like you could breathe a breath of fresh air as we actually burst out of the apartment as he falls from the balcony at the end there. But I love that. Although it's a weird little shot, that shot, isn't it? When he drops from the balcony.
Well, it's definitely something that hasn't aged well. But I think, again, we're like, fine. They very obviously like hand painted Jimmy Stewart into another frame of him fall. You know, he's probably like falling 2 feet on a flat surface, and they're like, no, he's vertical. Oh, look at him. Oh, he's falling. But yeah, no, when we bust out of it, it's great storytelling from Hitchcock again that, you know, like I say, we don't go into the other flats, but we're suddenly in the courtyard because Jimmy Stewart is in the courtyard. So we are very much tethered to his experience.
Yes.
I don't know that I would have been quite like the fall itself. I think they didn't choreograph this film to be shot from those angles, but I think otherwise, you know, bravo. I think of course they had to go there at that point, but it does look a little bit like maybe he didn't tell the production designer until that day. So
yeah, and the actual moment of home invasion too, where the bad guy Thorwald walks across and penetrates for the first time the safety of Jimmy Stewart's apartment. I know.
I did not consent to the use of that word.
Hey, it has to be said, doesn't it? Like, just this sudden, because you just feel like throughout the whole film that his space is the safe space and we're distanced from that bad guy.
No, absolutely.
And that amazing moment when it's just all done via sound design, when he turns off all the lights and you can hear Thorwald's footsteps coming again. Like, I love that little home invasion moment at the end. It's genuinely frightening, I think. You know?
Well, and Stewart is there just so deeply impotent.
Yes, it's kind of like Wait Until Dark, right? It's like you've got this person that is sort of in some way differently abled and somebody's coming for them. Yeah.
Well, and again, the usage of flash and bright lights to disorient an intruder as well, which is quite cool. And it's you know, again, it's not the most convincing fight sequence. I don't think Hitchcock's gonna be doing any Bourne movies anytime soon, but it doesn't matter because that's not what it's doing. So I think, you know, yes, we cut it slack, but this film has no right to be as good as it is as this far on. Like, it is a fantastic film, and even though it has aged in places through techniques or cultural tropes, I do think it's still there's obvious reasons why it's on the lists that it's on.
I agree. It's I mean, it's such a crowd pleaser. It's such a technical feat. It's beautiful. It ticks all the boxes, doesn't it, for both critics and audiences. Jem, we're going to wrap up shortly, but first of all, let's head on over to this week's Wild About Horror segment, because of course, Freudian cinephile Mary Wild has plenty of thoughts on Alfred Hitchcock's Rear Window.
Hey Mike, Mary Wild here, with some thoughts on Alfred Hitchcock's mystery thriller film Rear Window, the granddaddy of surveillance films, a masterful exploration of Hitch's obsession with voyeurism and the neurotic need to scrutinize. While recuperating from a broken leg, professional photographer Jeff is confined to a wheelchair in his New York City apartment. His rear window looks out onto a courtyard and other apartments. During an intense heat wave, he watches his neighbors who keep their windows open to stay cool. They are a lonely woman whom Jeff nicknames Miss Lonely Hearts, a newlywed couple, a pianist, a sexy dancer he nicknames Miss Torso, a middle-aged couple whose small dog likes digging in the flower garden, and Lars Thorwald, a traveling costume jewelry salesman with a bedridden wife. Jeff is visited regularly by his girlfriend Lisa, a stylish Park Avenue fashion designer and model, who tries to convince him to choose a work assignment that keeps him in New York on a permanent basis, rather than globetrot chasing precarious situations. But Jeff's persona is of a daredevil, hooked on exotic locations where danger hangs in the air. He's become well known for taking difficult pictures no one else can get, including the one of an out-of-control race car that smashed his camera and broke his leg instantly after it was snapped. Injured on duty, the photojournalist is now in a passive role of spectator, laid up with a heavy leg cast that runs all the way up to his hip. The irony that action man Jeff should remain in one spot for the entire duration of the film. I will argue later that his fixed, impotent position reveals the true nature of his pathology, that of a sexless, obsessional neurotic who retreats from the life force and leans into self-sabotaging patterns that ensure only his absence. In the opening scene of the film, we see the residential building Jeff stares at, each open window framing a subjective scene out there in the world, like an enormous gallery exhibition or a multiplex of unfolding movies. Hitch's camera lingers on this, then pans inside onto Jeff's apartment walls, covered in small framed photos from his various work projects, the interior squares mirroring the exterior squares. Jeff, who purports to be an unpredictable thrill seeker, seems to enjoy neatly compartmentalized and tidily arranged windows of activity wherever he can find them. We also notice the image of a beautiful blonde woman on the cover of a fashion magazine, whom we are invited to associate with Lisa. Interestingly, the photo negative of the pretty woman is framed, but why should this be? Perhaps she and the pressure of stable married life Lisa represents pose the strongest threat to Jeff, scarier than crashing cars and exploding bombs. The act of framing an image has a connotation of finality. It's the full stop at the end of the photographic sentence. How curious that Jeff chooses to commit to a reversed, inside-out representation of the feminine condition. One night, Jeff hears the sounds of someone screaming and glass breaking from across the courtyard. The next morning, he notices that Thorwald's wife has disappeared and observes him cleaning a large knife and handsaw. Jeff becomes convinced that Thorwald has murdered his wife and shares his theory with his girlfriend Lisa and nurse Stella. Soon after, the neighbor's dog is found dead. The distressed owner shouts, and everyone runs to their windows except Thorwald, who sits quietly in his dark apartment smoking a cigar. Jeff believes Thorwald buried something in the flower bed and killed the dog because it was digging at it. When Thorwald leaves, Lisa and Stella dig up the flowers but find nothing. Much to Jeff's astonishment, Lisa climbs up the fire escape to Thorwald's apartment and sneaks in through the open window. Thorwald returns and confronts Lisa. There's a chance he'll kill her on the spot. Jeff calls the police and reports an assault in progress. Eventually, Thorwald realizes that Lisa is signaling to someone and spots Jeff across the courtyard. So what's really going on here? For a start, Rear Window is a wonderful representation of scopophilia, a key concept in psychoanalysis referring to the pleasure of looking. Hitch understood how closely this is tied to the cinematic experience. Jeff likes to watch. He's a talented photographer, but in my view, he hides behind the lens in a dysfunctional way. The demands of his job to go anywhere in the world at a moment's notice and risk his life for the sake of a good shot obstruct him from progressing the emotional and intimate aspects of himself. This results in him being developmentally stuck. He channels libidinal energy exclusively into searching for and looking at far-off scenarios that have nothing to do with him. Of course, the gag in Rear Window is that the famously voyeuristic Jeff fails to appreciate his girlfriend's exquisite beauty. Lisa catwalks chicly through his apartment like something out of a dream, but she barely gets a look in. Seriously though, what's the matter with this Jeff guy? Lisa is a catch. Beautiful, thoughtful, smart. He won't settle down in New York, so she's willing to up sticks and wander the world with him. He comes up with a range of excuses to avoid a commitment and keep things status quo. She tries to sleep with him, but he cock-blocks himself. Kinda pathetic. His constant dodging of the erotic dimension reminds me of Freud's Ratman case study about a 29-year-old Austrian lawyer who sought psychotherapy in 1907, complaining of obsessive fears and debilitating compulsive behaviors. The patient's real name was Ernst Lanzer. Freud referred to him as Ratman because of his nightmarish fantasies about rats. Lanzer loved his girlfriend of 9 years, but he avoided marriage and kept kicking the relationship can down the road. Lanzer's problems were that he was inhibited, ruminated a lot, delayed commitment, repeatedly went over bizarre time-consuming activities, and unconsciously associated sexual gratification with injury, threat, and harm. This reminds me a lot of Jeff in Rear Window, because the fantasy he's invested in, the drama of the nearby apartment building, features sexuality via Miss Torso and the Newlyweds, but also heartbreak in the form of Miss Lonely Hearts and spousal murder courtesy of Thorwald. Eroticism here is paradoxically linked with destruction, pleasure with punishment. In this building, if you get off, you get offed. Like the Ratman, Jeff is beset with ambivalence and procrastination, unable to act. On his cast is written, "Here lie the broken bones of Jeffries," invoking the image of a mortified man, both in the sense of being embarrassed and also undead, existing merely as a live corpse. Obsessional neurosis symptoms conveniently prevent the subject from having to make difficult life decisions, removing the pressure of managing erotic and hostile impulses directly. Indeed, I regard Jeff's intrusive thoughts and sordid spy fetish as protracted compulsive rituals that save him from looking at his life in a radically honest and meaningful way. What amazes me about Rear Window is that Jeff's girlfriend Lisa goes above and beyond to express her love for him, not only by entertaining his convoluted true crime theories, but also by literally breaking and entering the scene of the building. Physically climbing into Jeff's fantasy space is Lisa's last-ditch attempt to make him notice her. She's willing to scale the wall and insert herself inside his number one object of interest, Thorwald's flat, because this is the only way he'll pay attention to her. It's utterly shocking when she does this. It might seem like she's revealing a cool and spontaneous aspect of her personality, but my perception is that Lisa is merely overcompensating for Jeff's powerlessness to affect the scenes he obsessively watches. She wholly identifies and aligns with his lack by transposing herself onto the building. She's backed into a corner, fusing her material self with the sight of her boyfriend's desire, because nothing excites him as much as this. Earlier, when Lisa believed the theory about Thorwald to be incorrect, she lamented to Jeff, "If someone came in here, they wouldn't believe what they'd see. You and me with long faces plunged into despair because we find out a man didn't kill his wife. We're two of the most frightening ghouls I've ever known." My proposition is that Lisa and Jeff are ghouls, whether Thorwald is a murderer or not, because they're projecting their eroticism onto a situation that doesn't concern them. They are dissociated. In the final scene of Rear Window, Jeff rests in his wheelchair, now with casts on both legs after the climactic confrontation with Thorwald. Beside him, Lisa reads a book titled Beyond the High Himalayas. After seeing that Jeff is sleeping, Lisa enthusiastically reaches for an item she far prefers, a copy of the women's fashion magazine, Harper's Bazaar. This tells us that Lisa is now indefinitely upholding the tiresome facade of adventure woman to please her excuse-prone, non-committal boyfriend Jeff. As long as she's centering what he wants, there is no space in the relationship for her desire. She'll have to surreptitiously pursue the things that please her and live authentically away from his conscious awareness. The concluding images of Rear Window are that of Lisa and Jeff experientially aligned with Miss Lonelyhearts, who acts out a dinner date as if she has a suitor with her in the apartment while being completely alone. Similarly to the lonely neighbor they spy on, Lisa and Jeff are play acting and kidding themselves. Terrifyingly, they are in a relationship with phantoms, imaginary versions of each other that do not exist in a substantial way. They're together, but upon closer inspection, they are simply not there. Until next time.
A big thank you to the wonderful Mary Wilde. And don't forget, if you want to hear more of Mary's psychoanalytic takes on cinema and culture, you can sign up to her Patreon, patreon.com/Mary Wilde. Well, Jen, I think there's not much more we can say about this movie. I mean, it's pretty much perfect, right? It does exactly everything you want it to do.
It really, it's the personification of does what it says on the tin, you know, and it's that poster, the title, its job's a good one. It's absolutely
perfection.
And you know what? If you're ever going over to your parents and you don't want to spend time talking to them, just put on Rear Window. Everybody loves it. It'll be fine.
It's true. It's cross-generational, I think, that film, isn't it? Totally. You can watch it with your grandparents, and I reckon even a kid would enjoy it. It ticks all the boxes. So
it
true.
really does. Yeah, it's a good one.
Amazing. Well, there you go. Well, Jen, thank you so much for joining me today to talk about some creepy, sleazy Hitchcock movies. I love it.
Excellent. Anytime, my friend.
Anytime. And in the meantime, just let people know where they can find you if they want to come and find you on social media or keep up to date with everything you've got going on.
Absolutely. Best thing to do is have a look at me over on Twitter, which, until that cesspool completely disappears, I'm available at Jen Handorf over there. And I look forward to kind of announcing things as they come out over this year. I think people are gonna enjoy them and be upset by them in equal measure, but all consensually.
That's what we love. Amazing. Jen, thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks, Mike.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening. And one more time, a huge thank you to all of this week's incredible guests. Mary Wilde for her brilliant Wild About Horror segment, Jen Handorf, and the brilliant Mark Cousins. What an episode. I really hope you guys enjoyed listening to that, and I hope you guys enjoyed those two phenomenal films as much as I did. Let me know your thoughts. Get in touch. You can email evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all the socials. And if you want to discuss this week's episode with fellow listeners, you can join the Evolution of Horror discussion group on Facebook, or you can join the Evolution of Horror Discord. If you want to support the making of this podcast financially and get treated to regular bonus content and more, then sign up to our Patreon, patreon.com/Evolution of Horror. You can find this podcast in all the usual podcast platforms, and if you get a spare minute, I'd be so grateful if you could drop us a little rating and review on Apple Podcasts or whichever app you use, as that really helps us get discovered by new listeners. So, on to next week then. Next week's going to be a really, really fun one. We are moving away from Alfred Hitchcock, and we move into the 50s and 60s to explore the world of Grand Dame Guignol, or hagsploitation, whatever you prefer to call it. Next week, I'm going to be joined by Gaylords of Darkness's very own Anthony Hudson to discuss Sunset Boulevard from 1950 and whatever happened to Baby Jane from 1962. Holy shit, it's going to be a good discussion. Join us next week for all of this and more on the Evolution of horror.